Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the center of the world. The year is 160 AD. The sun is beating down on white marble, reflecting a brilliance that hurts your eyes. You are in Rome. The air smells of spices from the east, grain from Egypt, and the sweat of 1 million people living in the greatest city humanity has ever constructed. To the north, the legions hold the line against the forests of Germania. To the south, the Sahara is merely a border, not a barrier. From the misty shores of Britain to the burning sands of Syria, one law rules. One language connects the elite. One currency buys bread and wine. It feels eternal. It feels like the universe has finally found its order, and that order is Roman. If you were a citizen walking these streets, you would look at the Colosseum, rising like a mountain of stone, and you would believe that this empire would last until the end of time. How could something this heavy, this powerful, this absolute ever fall? But history is not written in stone. It is written in sand, and the wind was already blowing. The tragedy of Rome is not that it was murdered by a single villain in a dark alley. Rome was not destroyed by a sudden cataclysm or a meteor striking the earth. No, the tragedy is much more painful because it was slower. It was a silent suicide. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, inflicted over centuries, often by the very hands that swore to protect it. And to understand this story, to truly feel the weight of this collapse, we have to look past the dates and the battles. We have to look at the soul of the empire. We have to look at the moment when the heart of Rome stopped beating for the people and started beating only for itself. The rot began at the very height of the glory. It usually does. When you are at the top of the mountain, the only way to go is down. It started with a whisper in the marketplaces, a silver denarius, the coin of the realm, the symbol of Roman trust, began to feel different, lighter. For generations, a Roman soldier knew that the silver in his hand was real. It was a promise. But emperors needed money. They needed to pay for lavish games to keep the mob happy. They needed to pay the soldiers to keep them loyal. And when the silver ran out, they made a choice, a fatal choice. They started mixing copper into the silver. Just a little at first. Nobody would notice, they thought. But people always notice. The shopkeeper knows. The baker knows. The prices started to creep up, slowly. The trust that held this vast empire together began to evaporate. It was the first cut, a small one, barely bleeding, but the infection had entered the bloodstream. Then came the failure of leadership. For a long time, Rome was lucky. It had the 5 good emperors, men who ruled with wisdom and duty. But biology is a cruel roulette wheel. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the man who wrote about stoicism and duty while fighting in the mud of the Danube, made one terrible mistake. He didn't choose the best man to succeed him. He chose his son, Commodus. If you want to pinpoint the moment the Golden Age turned to rust, look at Commodus. He didn't care about the borders. He didn't care about the Senate. He wanted to be a gladiator. He wanted the roar of the crowd. He wanted to play God while the administration crumbled. When he was finally strangled in his bath, a pathetic end for a master of the world, Rome didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It panicked. What followed was a year of madness that shattered the illusion of order. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, realized a terrifying truth. They held the sword, so they held the power. They murdered the emperor, and then, in a moment that should make you shudder with its cynicism, they auctioned the empire off to the highest bidder. Imagine that. The throne of Augustus, the seat of Caesar, sold like a piece of cattle to a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. He stood on the ramparts, shouting out prices, buying the world with gold he didn't truly have. The people of Rome watched in silence. They watched their dignity being sold. And in that silence, something broke. The reverence for the emperor was gone, replaced with fear and disgust. This was a deep cut, a wound that went straight to the bone. The 3rd century brought a storm that nearly washed the empire away entirely. We call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but that name is too academic. It doesn't capture the horror. Imagine living in a world where the government changes every 2 years, usually by murder. In a span of 50 years, Rome saw 26 emperors. Only one died of natural causes. Think about the instability that creates. If you're a governor in Gaul, do you listen to the emperor in Rome? By the time your letter reaches him, he might be dead. So you stop listening. You start looking out for yourself. The empire began to fracture. Generals declared themselves emperors of their own little regions. The map of Rome, once a solid block of red, shattered into a mosaic of competing warlords. And while the Romans were busy killing each other, the world outside was waking up. For centuries, the tribes beyond the Rhine and the Danube were disorganized. They fought with spears and courage, but they lacked discipline. But they had been watching. They had been learning. They served as mercenaries in Roman armies. They learned the formations. They learned the tactics. And now they saw the giants stumbling. They saw the legions thinning out to fight civil wars. The wolves began to circle. Raids became invasions. Cities that had never known war, cities deep inside the empire, with no walls because they felt so safe, suddenly saw smoke on the horizon. The psychological shock was devastating. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was a lie. You were not safe. The legions could not protect you. To survive, Rome had to transform. It had to become harder, crueler. Enter Diocletian. He was a soldier, a man of iron discipline. He looked at this chaotic, bleeding empire and realized it was too big for one man to rule. So he took a knife and sliced the map in half, east and west. It seemed like a brilliant administrative move. It stabilized the chaos. It stopped the bleeding for a while. But it created a permanent divide. The East was rich. It had the old civilizations of Greece and Egypt. It had grain, gold, and trade routes. The West had forests, struggling farms, and the longest, hardest borders to defend. By splitting the empire, Diocletian unintentionally condemned the West to a slow death. He saved the structure, but he killed the unity. Rome was no longer one body. It was Siamese twins, and the stronger one was starting to drag the weaker one down. Then came Constantine. He united the empire again for a moment, but he made a decision that sealed the fate of the city of Rome itself. He looked at the old capital, crowded, politically toxic, stuck in the past, and he turned his back on it. He built a new capital in the east, Constantinople, Nova Roma. It was beautiful, it was strategic, it was Christian, and it sucked the life out of the West. The best minds, the best artists, the most ambitious generals, the wealth, it all flowed east. Rome, the eternal city, the mother of the empire, became a museum. It was a symbolic home, an old grandmother that you visit once a year out of obligation, but you don't let her run the family business anymore. The heart of the empire had migrated. The body in Italy was still moving, but it was hollow.
Let's move forward to the late 4th century. The atmosphere has changed. The air is colder. The optimism of the past is gone, replaced by a grim determination just to survive the winter. And a new player enters the stage, a force of nature that would push the dominoes over: the Huns. They came from the steppes of Asia, a cavalry force so terrifying, so alien, that they sparked a panic migration. They didn't just attack Rome, they attacked the people who were attacking Rome. The Goths, a proud Germanic people living on the border, found themselves caught between the Huns and the Roman legions. Terrified, they appeared on the banks of the Danube River, tens of thousands of them, men, women, children, wagons, livestock. They weren't an army of conquest, they were refugees. They begged the Roman Emperor Valens for sanctuary. This was a pivotal moment, a moment where history held its breath. Rome had absorbed tribes before. It was the Roman way. You take the barbarian, you give him land, you put him in the army, and in 2 generations, his son is a Roman citizen named Maximus. It was how the empire renewed itself. Valens agreed to let them cross. But the Roman system was corrupt. The local commanders, greedy and short-sighted, saw these desperate refugees not as future citizens, but as targets for exploitation. They starved the Goths. They sold them dog meat in exchange for their children to be sold into slavery. Can you imagine the rage? To flee from monsters, only to be treated like animals by your saviors? The Goths had kept their weapons, and when the hunger became too much, the gratitude turned to fury. The refugees became an army inside the borders. The explosion happened at Adrianople in 378 AD. It is a battle that should haunt every student of military history. The Emperor Valens, arrogant and eager for glory, marched out to crush this rabble. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He thought it would be a slaughter. It was, but not the one he expected. The Gothic cavalry smashed into the exhausted Roman infantry like a hammer hitting glass. The legions, the invincible war machine that had conquered the known world, were annihilated. Emperor Valens was killed on the battlefield, his body never found. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a psychological apocalypse. The myth of Roman invincibility was dead. The barbarians knew it, the Romans knew it. The walls were breached, and the enemy was already inside the house. But Rome didn't fall that day. It was too big to fall all at once. It continued to stagger on, a wounded giant. The next few decades were a blur of compromises. The Romans couldn't defeat the Goths, so they hired them. Think about the irony. The defenders of the empire were now the very people who wanted to dismantle it. The army became Roman in name only. The soldiers spoke German dialects. Their loyalty was to their tribal commanders, not to a distant emperor in Ravenna. The generals, Stilicho, Aetus, Ricimer, were the true power. The emperors were merely puppets, children or weaklings hiding behind high walls playing with chickens while the provinces burned. And then the unthinkable happened. The year 410 AD. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had been played for a fool by the Roman court one too many times. He wanted land, he wanted a title, he wanted food for his people. Rome gave him promises and then broke them. So he marched to the gates of Rome itself. The city had not been conquered by a foreign enemy in 800 years, 8 centuries of safety. The citizens inside couldn't believe it was happening. They thought some miracle would save them. They thought the ghosts of Caesar and Scipio would rise up. But there were no ghosts. There was only starvation. The siege was brutal. And then, one night, the Salarian Gate was opened.
Maybe it was a sympathizer. Maybe it was a starving slave. It doesn't matter. The Goths poured in. For 3 days, Rome was sacked. The Goths didn't burn it to the ground. They wanted loot, not destruction. But the violation was absolute. The statues were stripped of gold. The sanctuaries were defiled. The wealthy senators who had spent their lives debating philosophy in their villas were dragged into the streets. The news sent a shockwave across the world. St. Jerome, sitting in his cell in Bethlehem, wept when he heard the news. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, he wrote. It was the psychological end of the world. If Rome could burn, then nothing was safe. God had abandoned the empire. Yet, life went on. That is the strangest part of the collapse. The sun came up the next day. People still needed to eat. The bureaucracy still tried to collect taxes. But the fabric was torn beyond repair. The West was dissolving. Britain was abandoned, the legions simply packing up and leaving the islanders to the darkness. Gaul was carved up by Franks and Burgundians. Spain fell to the Suebi and Vandals. North Africa, the breadbasket of Rome, the source of the grain that fed the city, was conquered by the Vandals. This was the jugular vein. Without African grain, Rome starved. The population of the great city plummeted. The 1 million people who once cheered in the Colosseum shrank to a few 100,000, then 50,000. The great monuments began to be cannibalized. People stripped the marble from the temples to burn for lime. They stole the bronze clamps from the Colosseum to melt down for weapons or tools. Rome was eating itself. The final act was almost a comedy, if it weren't so tragic. There was no great last stand, no Spartans at Thermopylae. In 476 A.D., the Emperor of the West was a child, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Look at that name, Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus, the first great emperor. This boy carried the names of the beginning and the glory, but he held none of the power. He was a figurehead, a ghost wearing a crown that was too heavy for his head. The barbarian general Odoacer decided he was tired of the charade. He didn't even bother to kill the boy. He just retired him. He sent him away to live in a villa in the south with a pension. Odoacer didn't declare himself emperor. He realized the title was meaningless. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the scepter, to Constantinople, with a note that essentially said, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore." And that was it. No explosion, no fire from the sky. The sun went down on the Roman Empire in the West, and nobody really noticed. The people in the fields kept working. The monks in the monasteries kept praying. But the light was gone. The structure that had protected civilization, that had built the roads, the aqueducts, the laws, it was gone. The Dark Ages were descending, a long twilight where knowledge would be lost, where safety was a memory, and where the ruins of the giants would stand as silent witnesses to a greatness that mankind would not see again for 1,000 years. But wait, this isn't just a story about stones and dead men. It's a warning, because as we look back at the smoldering ruins of the greatest empire on earth, we have to ask ourselves, how did it feel to live through it? What happened to the soul of the Roman people? Because empires don't just die on the battlefield, they die in the hearts of their citizens first. We need to go deeper. We need to walk through the mud of the collapsing frontier and smell the fear in the Senate House. We need to understand the spiritual crisis that allowed a new religion, Christianity, to rise from the catacombs and conquer the empire that was killing it.
We have to rewind. To truly understand the death of a giant, you cannot just look at the moment it stops breathing. you have to look at the long sickness that came before. We talked about emperors and generals, but the death of Rome was also biological. It was a betrayal of nature itself. Imagine it is the year 165 AD. The empire is still technically at its peak. The legions are returning from a victorious campaign in the east, marching down the Appian Way. The crowds cheer, they throw flowers. But the soldiers are bringing something back with them that is far deadlier than any sword. They are coughing. Their skin is breaking out in black sores. The Entine Plague had arrived. It was likely smallpox, a demon the ancient world had no name for and no defense against. It swept through the empire like a wildfire through dry grass. It didn't care if you were a slave or a senator. It killed a quarter of the population. In some cities, there was no one left to bury the dead. The bodies were simply piled in carts and hauled away like refuse. The psychological scar this left on the Roman mind cannot be overstated. If the gods favored Rome, why were they letting the people rot alive? The temples were full of incense. The priests sacrificed white bulls, but the plague kept killing. This was the moment the economy began to die. When you lose a quarter of your people, you lose a quarter of your taxpayers. You lose a quarter of your farmers. You lose a quarter of your soldiers. But the costs of running the empire didn't go down, they went up. The emperors needed more money to defend the borders, but there were fewer people to pay. So they squeezed. The tax collectors became the most feared men in the village. They were no longer agents of civilization. They were vultures picking at a carcass. The pressure became so intense that the middle class, the backbone of Rome, the local councilors, the shop owners, began to simply give up. In the Golden Age, being a Roman citizen was a badge of honor. Men would fight to be elected to the local city council. It meant prestige. But by the 4th century, it was a curse. If the city couldn't pay its taxes to Rome, the councilors had to pay the difference out of their own pockets. Who would want that job? Men started fleeing the cities. They ran to their country estates, building high walls, creating their own little self-sufficient worlds. This was the beginning of feudalism. The great open society of Rome, where you could travel from one end to the other on safe roads, was closing in on itself. The horizons were shrinking. And into this vacuum of hope, into this world of sickness and tax collectors and constant fear, stepped a new idea: Christianity. To the traditional Roman elite, the Christians were a bizarre atheistic cult. They refused to sacrifice to the emperor. They refused to participate in the public festivals. They were haters of humanity. But to the masses, to the slave, the widow, and the soldier dying of smallpox, Christianity offered something Jupiter and Mars never could: dignity and hope. The old gods were transactional. You give Jupiter a bull, he gives you rain. Maybe. But if you die, you go to the underworld, a gray, shadowy place where everyone is miserable. It didn't matter if you were a hero or a villain, death was the end. Christianity said, no. This life is just a test. The suffering you feel now doesn't matter. There is a kingdom waiting for you that is better than Rome. When the plagues hit, the pagan priests fled the cities to save themselves. The Christians stayed. They nursed the sick. They buried the dead. They died alongside them. People watched this. They saw a courage that transcended the fear of death. By the time Constantine converted in 312 AD, the empire was already Christian in its heart. The victory of the cross was not a military conquest. It was a spiritual takeover. But this changed the loyalty of the people. For 1,000 years, the ultimate authority was the state. The empire was the highest good. Now, there was a higher king. If the emperor commanded you to do something that went against God, you disobeyed the emperor. The absolute grip of the Roman state was broken. The best minds of the generation didn't become generals or administrators anymore. They became bishops and monks. St. Augustine wasn't trying to save the Roman Empire. He was writing the City of God, arguing that Rome was merely an earthly city, flawed and temporary, while the City of God was eternal.
He was preparing the people for the end. He was telling them, let Rome fall, we have something else. And so when the West finally collapsed in 476, it was, in a strange way, a relief. The charade was over. The tax collector wasn't coming anymore. The legions weren't coming to drag your sons away to fight in Persia. But the tragedy wasn't finished. There is one last cruel twist in the story of Rome's suicide, a moment where it could have been saved, but was instead destroyed forever. We must look east. While the West fell into darkness, the East, Constantinople, was still shining. They called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek, but they wore the toga and followed Roman law. In the year 527, a man named Justinian took the throne. He was ambitious, intelligent, and obsessed with the past. He couldn't accept that Rome, the mother city, was in the hands of barbarians. He wanted it back. He launched the Gothic Wars.
It sounds noble, doesn't it? The empire striking back, the liberation of Italy. But war is not a movie. It is a grinder. Justinian's general, Belisarius, a genius of warfare, landed in Italy. He took Rome back. The Goths retook it. The Romans took it back again. For 20 years, Italy was a battlefield. The armies marched back and forth, burning crops, destroying aqueducts, slaughtering the population. When the dust finally settled, Justinian had won. He held Italy. But at what cost? Rome was a corpse. The great aqueducts that had supplied the city with millions of gallons of fresh water were cut. The baths were dry. The sewers were clogged. The population, which had already fallen, crashed to near zero. The Senate, which had survived the kings, the Republic, the Empire, and the barbarian sackings, finally disappeared. Justinian didn't save Rome. He exterminated it. The city that had ruled the world was now a ghost town of crumbling ruins, inhabited by a few thousand people huddling in the shadows of the Colosseum, planting vegetable gardens in the Forum where Cicero once spoke. This was the final cut, the physical destruction of the ancient world's infrastructure. Now walk with me through the ruins. It is the year 600 A.D. The sun is setting over the Palatine Hill. The palaces of the Caesars are still there, but the roofs have collapsed. Vines are choking the marble columns. There is a silence here that is heavy, almost suffocating. You can hear the wind whistling through the empty arches of the Basilica of Maxentius. Down below, in the muddy field that was once the center of the world, a cow is grazing. A shepherd leans against a broken statue of a forgotten god, watching his flock. He doesn't know who built these massive structures. He calls them the work of giants or demons. He doesn't know how to read the inscriptions. The knowledge is gone. The darkness has truly fallen. The libraries are closed or burned. The trade routes are broken. You can no longer buy pottery from Africa or glass from Syria. The world has become small, local, and dangerous. Literacy retreats into the monasteries, where monks tirelessly copy ancient texts by candlelight, preserving the last sparks of civilization while the storm rages outside. They are the lifeboats in the ocean of barbarism. But is this really the end? Is this where we fade to black? No, because Rome did not die. It changed states. It evaporated and then rained down upon the future. Look at the map of Europe today. The borders of the nations, France, Spain, Italy, England, they are the ghosts of Roman provinces. Look at the languages. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. They are just modern versions of the Latin spoken by the soldiers and the traders. Every time you say salary, you are speaking Roman. From salarium, the salt money paid to soldiers. Every time you use a calendar, you are using the system Julius Caesar designed. Look at the Church. The Catholic Church stepped into the power vacuum Rome left behind. The Pope took the title Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest, a title held by the Roman emperors. The dioceses, the vestments, the incense, the Latin language, the hierarchy. It is the ghost of the Roman Empire, baptized and given a new mission. Rome didn't disappear. It became the software of Western civilization. But the lesson of Rome is not about its legacy. It is about its fragility. The story of Rome's suicide tells us that civilization is not a natural state. It is a garden. It requires constant tending. If you stop weeding, if you stop watering, if you let the walls crumble, the jungle will come back. Rome fell because the people stopped believing it was worth saving. They stopped sacrificing for the common good and started fighting for their own piece of the pie. The elites retreated to their gated villas, the poor lost hope, and the army became a mercenary force loyal only to the highest bidder. Does that sound familiar? Standing in the ruins of the Colosseum today, surrounded by tourists taking selfies, you can almost feel the echo of the crowd. You can hear the roar of a civilization that thought it was eternal. They thought their walls were high enough. They thought their gold was bright enough. They were wrong. Rome died 1,000 deaths so that we could learn one lesson. Nothing is guaranteed. The darkness is always waiting at the gates. The question is not whether the barbarians are coming. They are always coming. The question is, are we strong enough within ourselves to keep the lights on? The sun sets on the Forum. The marble turns a soft, bruising purple in the twilight. The shadows lengthen, covering the broken stones. But in the distance, the bells of a church begin to ring. A new day will come, but it will never be the same. The dream of Rome is over. The reality of history marches on. This is the story of the greatest suicide in history, a tragedy written in blood, gold, and hubris. And it is a story that is still being written in every society that forgets that greatness is a burden, not a privilege.